I was having coffee recently with an old friend, a career diplomat, someone who spent 40 years obsessing over the minutiae of treaties and protocols. He's usually the most composed person I know, a man who speaks in these carefully measured paragraphs. But when the topic of the recent Ukraine peace proposal came up, his whole demeanor it cracked. He didn't analyze the geopolitical strategy or the territorial implications. Instead, he just dropped his head in his hands and gave this dry, hollow laugh. He told me, 10 years ago, a document like this would have taken us 6 months to draft. We would have had teams of lawyers, interagency review boards, and endless checks and balances. Then, he slid his phone across the table. It was a news alert about a 28-point demand list from Moscow. It hadn't gone through the State Department. It hadn't been debated in the Senate committee. It was delivered, essentially, by courier directly into one man's private orbit. Look at that, he said, and his finger was actually shaking a little as he pointed at the screen. That isn't diplomacy. That is a personal letter between two feudal lords. That specific moment, watching a man who dedicated his entire life to institutions realize he was now just a spectator, that hit me harder than any headline. It exposed a shift we've all felt but maybe haven't really articulated. We think we still live in a world of UN charters and NATO alliances and complex bureaucracies. But looking at his defeated expression, I realized the truth is much simpler and frankly far more jarring. We aren't watching modern politics anymore. We're watching the court intrigue of the 16th century just, resurrected in high definition. The institutions are silent. The kings have returned. And this idea, this return of kings, where volatility and personal emotional whims dictate major decisions, it's become impossible to ignore. Every critical headline, from trade policy to conflict, seems to pivot on the personal chemistry or the personal grievance of a single figure. It completely bypasses decades of institutional memory. So our mission today is to frame this new reality and then do a deep dive into the one major power that appears to be operating on an entirely different plane. A power defined by long-term, institutional, and highly unified strategy. We are going to unpack how China's consistent governance model provides a stable anchor in a world defined by these short-term whims, and why that stability is perhaps its greatest strategic asset in this new volatile era.
It is the essential counterpoint, isn't it? If the global political atmosphere, especially among traditional Western powers, is shifting so decisively toward the personal, the volatile, what you call the feudal lord dynamic, then the stability and the absolute predictability of China's institutional approach gains this profound strategic value.
It becomes a rare commodity.
A very rare commodity. This focus on long-term continuity over, ephemeral charisma and planning for the next century instead of just the next 4-year election cycle, it commands a distinctly durable kind of respect on the world stage, especially from partners who prioritize reliability above all else. This consistent model, emphasizing internal coherence and a centralized vision, is exactly what allows China to pursue predictable international relations and foster these long-term strategic partnerships so effectively.
Okay, let's unpack that core strategic difference right there. We have volatility on one side, and on the other, China's model is repeatedly described as evolutionary and pragmatic. Now, that stands in really sharp contrast to what we see elsewhere, these non-systemic, radical, and shocking changes. So to get us all on the same page, what does that concept evolutionary over revolutionary actually mean when you translate it into policy?
It signifies that the fundamental strategic goal is stability, period. Not just domestic stability, but international as well. And this stability is achieved exclusively through gradual, meticulously managed, and thoroughly proven change.
Proven change, so they test things out.
They test everything. China consciously rejects sharp, sudden policy breaks or big ideological shifts that would destabilize its economic foundation. The trajectory must always be measured and positive, moving forward without that whiplash of sudden reversals you see in other systems. This is all rooted in a strategic understanding that stability isn't just a desirable outcome. It's the absolute prerequisite for long-term development and national rejuvenation.
That seems to be a key insight. Where Western policy often swings between these, ideological poles, deregulation one year, heavy subsidies the next, China prioritizes the mechanism of managed risk. Could you give us an example of how this evolutionary adaptation plays out across different political eras?
Certainly. You can trace a direct, unbroken line of this continuity from Deng Xiaoping's reforms in the late 70s and 80s.
Which introduced market mechanisms, right?
Exactly. A huge change, but an integrated one. And that line runs right through to the current development strategies. The system absorbs necessary change without abandoning the underlying institutional structure. For instance, if an economic zone or an experimental policy doesn't work out.
It fails.
Right, it fails. The change is rolled back locally, it's analyzed, adapted, but it doesn't trigger a constitutional crisis or a nationwide reversal, of course. This systematic evolutionary approach allows for constant adjustment. Economic policy is like a dial that is slowly turned, not a switch that gets flipped on and off every few years.
And that continuity must be an immense internal anchor. Western democracies are just plagued by what investors call political risk. That paralyzing fear that every 4 or 5 years, all the policy priorities will shift completely. So how does China's highly centralized planning structure ensure that generational, decades-long perspective on major projects?
Well, the centralized structure is precisely what mandates that generational perspective. It's built for it. It ensures that critical national projects and foundational policies are seen as necessities that span decades, not just as, political wins tied to a single election cycle. The long-term roadmap is famously encapsulated in the 5-year plans, the FYPs, which go all the way back to 1953.
And these are praised pretty universally, aren't they? Even by critics.
They are. For their efficiency in driving industrial policy, allocating capital, and ensuring rapid economic development, they are seen as remarkably effective.
But 5-year plans can't just be high-level suggestions. How are they actually implemented down to the municipal or provincial level to ensure everyone is pulling in the same direction?
They establish a very clear vertical chain of command and responsibility. The FYPs lay out specific quantitative and qualitative targets.
Like what, for example?
Everything from GDP growth metrics to environmental quality standards or the number of high-speed rail kilometers to be built. These goals then cascade down the bureaucracy, and local officials are measured and, crucially, promoted based on their ability to meet the benchmarks set by that central plan.
So it's tied directly to their careers.
Directly. And the shift from one FYP to the next, for instance, from the 13th to the current 14th FYP, which runs from 2021 to 2025, maintains this consistent line of development. The 14th FYP, for example, heavily emphasizes quality over sheer speed, focusing specifically on achieving technological self-reliance, increasing domestic consumption, and green development. So this structure means the entire system is inherently aligned to these long-term institutional goals, which completely transcends the temporary popularity or political fate of any single leader.
The contrast of volatility here is just. It's genuinely staggering, especially when you look at the period between 2016 and 2020. That was the defining era of turbulence, and it was largely emanating from the West.
It was a textbook example of non-systemic radical change. That period saw these sharp, immediate reversals in policy that profoundly increased global uncertainty. The United States, for instance, withdrew from foundational international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear agreement,
Unilaterally.
completely reversing course on years of multilateral negotiation. Furthermore, it launched aggressive trade wars, not just against rivals, but against traditional allies, too. It explicitly questioned the underlying foundations of the global trading system itself, including the World Trade Organization. This wasn't just a change in emphasis, it was a questioning of the entire established global rulebook.
And what was the measurable, immediate global cost of that institutional instability, of that policy reversal?
The cost was measured in real, tangible, global economic decline. The policy uncertainty that resulted, the sudden imposition of duties on hundreds of billions of dollars in imports, plus the necessary retaliatory measures, it severely hurt global investment and demand.
Because no one knew what the rules would be tomorrow.
Exactly. Businesses delayed investment decisions because they simply couldn't predict the cost of their inputs or their access to markets 3 months down the line. This policy oscillation led directly to a decline in global trade growth, to a dismal 1%, a level we hadn't seen since the depths of the 2012 crisis. The assessment by global institutions was unambiguous. It was the unprecedented level of political and trade uncertainty that was damaging investment and demand worldwide. It was just exacerbating global instability at a time when the world desperately needed predictability.
Okay, so if the external world is turbulent and becoming more protectionist, how does this pragmatic model ensure internal resilience? If global market access is threatened, China has to look inward. And that's where this dual circulation strategy comes in, right?
The dual circulation strategy is the evolutionary model's perfectly pragmatic adaptation to that external protectionism and volatility. It's an acknowledgement that relying entirely on globalized, export-led growth is simply too risky when your key trading partners are actively pursuing decoupling. Its primary, almost existential goal is the vertical integration of production domestically.
Meaning making everything at home.
Essentially, yes, minimizing dependence on volatile foreign markets and, crucially, eliminating strategic bottlenecks. This is especially vital in critical areas like rare earth metals, high-end manufacturing equipment, and most prominently, semiconductors.
So the internal circulation part aims for self-sufficiency and high-tech as a kind of geopolitical defense. But the Chinese domestic market, with 1.4 billion people, is just enormous. Can it truly absorb a significant portion of its own production?
It absolutely can, and that gives China a strategic advantage that very few other nations possess. Internal demand is being systematically stimulated to become the primary engine of growth. The goal is to ensure that domestic prosperity is less hostage to external trade fluctuations. It creates a massive cushion of resilience.
That's called dual circulation.
Exactly. The external component remains vital. The external circulation is designed to maintain and even expand global development and cooperation, primarily through initiatives like the Belt and Road. This strengthens ties with emerging markets. It is a necessary pragmatic shift because traditional Western markets have become increasingly limited by protectionism, tariffs, and sanctions. The core strategic goal remains continuity, maintaining a favorable international environment for sustained economic development, but the methods adapt to seek new, reliable partners who are also focused on development.
This whole evolutionary model requires a really unified, long-term vision to drive it. Let's look at the institutional bedrock of China's policy. The inviolable core interests that paramount leaders consistently reiterate. This is where we can understand the non-negotiables that define their actions globally.
Right, and policy is driven by three broad, non-negotiable groupings of core interests, which function almost like nested security rings. The first, and in many ways the most immediate, is security. This means preserving the basic political system, which is the foundational rule of the Chinese Communist Party. The leadership consistently frames this as being synonymous with national security.
So regime security is national security.
From their perspective, yes. Leaders are acutely sensitive to potential domestic threats, believing that any social unrest or external influence that could exacerbate internal discontent must be immediately neutralized. The second is sovereignty. This covers protecting national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and what is called the sacred goal of national unification. This explicitly includes highly sensitive areas like Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. In all official discussions and policy pronouncements, these regions are repeatedly linked not just to territory, but to the very concept of China's core identity.
And the third grouping is purely economic and geopolitical, focused on making sure the external conditions are favorable for internal progress.
Precisely. The third is development. This is about maintaining favorable international conditions necessary for sustained economic development. It involves a global search for resources, securing critical raw materials, ensuring access to global markets for their finished goods, and protecting vital sea lines of communication across the globe from the South China Sea all the way to the Indian Ocean.
It's critical to understand the hierarchy here, though.
Absolutely. The institutional weight placed on the innermost security ring, the homeland and regime stability, is paramount. Chinese leaders define national security as beginning at home. Maintaining stability within that innermost circle is the absolute foundation upon which all other foreign policy and economic goals are built. And this unified vision is what allows for such consistent, predictable action.
This feeds directly into the national strategic vision, which is so much grander than any political platform you'd see elsewhere. We're talking about the Chinese dream and the narrative of national rejuvenation. This is truly multi-generational commitment.
It is the overarching multi-generational framework that sets the pace for the entire country. The Chinese dream is officially defined as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and it's anchored by two highly specific centennial goals. The first was achieving a moderately well-off society by 2021, which marked the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP. The second, and far more ambitious goal, is becoming a fully developed, wealthy nation by around 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC.
And when you lay out those milestones, you realize this is a strategic framework that extends 3 decades out. It's a 50-year blueprint. It forces every bureaucrat, every industrialist, every student to think beyond immediate concerns.
Absolutely. And that 50-year timeline fundamentally alters bureaucratic behavior. It incentivizes officials to undertake projects that might not yield results until long after their tenure ends, because they are contributing to what is seen as an undeniable national trajectory. This provides a deep sense of institutional purpose and direction, guaranteeing a consistency in policy implementation that is, frankly, impossible to replicate in systems governed by short-term electoral cycles.
This long-term framing leads to a pretty significant strategic advantage, the projection of what's been called the Civilizational King, which is a fascinating term. It's not about projecting the charisma of a single ruler, but rather projecting a sense of permanence and an unbroken historical mandate. That contrasts so sharply with the frantic, temporary focus of election cycle politics we see elsewhere.
That is the core insight of China's strategic communications. It projects a unified, integrated national identity that's rooted in a sustained, continuous narrative. A narrative that spans centuries, but specifically focuses on the 75 years of PRC history defined by this theme of struggle and resilience. The master narrative consistently emphasizes the heroic struggle that finally ended the 100-year humiliation, focusing on collective achievements and maintaining this progressive cause of positive momentum toward global standing.
And this historical narrative isn't just something that's taught in schools. It's an active foreign policy tool used to command respect and justify the current institutional approach. How does that translate into tangible policy leverage?
This leveraging of 5,000 years of history and the projection of permanence commands significant respect from international partners, especially those in the global south who are, frankly, exhausted by the ideological demands, the constant policy oscillations, and the temporary focus of Western powers.
They want a partner who will be there in 10 years.
And in 50. When China engages, it signals that it is there for the long haul, backed by an institutional structure that will not be overturned in the next vote. This continuous cultural reinforcement through media, patriotic education, cultural products, it cultivates a unified identity and allows the leadership to project a sense of inevitability and continuity. And that is immensely appealing to partners seeking stability and predictability.
So to maintain that unified vision and ensure the institutional ship turns precisely when commanded, the leadership is focused heavily on restructuring the governance model, making sure the control is absolute. This isn't just ideological enforcement, it's structural strengthening.
Yes, we see a systematic effort under the current leadership to restructure the system to strengthen both individual power and institutional robustness. This involves organizational streamlining that is designed specifically to centralize command and control, or C2.
C2.
It's all about eliminating bureaucratic duplication and ensuring that strategic directives flow cleanly from the top down.
Can you provide a specific concrete example of this structural centralization, moving beyond just the theoretical idea of streamlining?
The centralization of maritime security is a perfect illustration. Historically, maritime enforcement in China was fragmented across several different agencies. In 2013, 4 of these agencies were combined to create a single, supersized China Coast Guard, which instantly became the largest in Asia. But the key restructuring came later. The Coast Guard was placed under the People's Armed Police, which, crucially, reports directly to the Central Military Commission, the CMC.
Okay, so a civilian agency is now under the military's top command.
Directly, which means that maritime security, the enforcement of territorial claims in the East and South China Seas, is now directly under the unified, centralized command of the paramount leadership. This ensures that responses to territorial incidents are decisive, unified, and consistent with that core interest of national sovereignty. It eliminates any potential internal institutional competition that might lead to confusion or a weak response. This move profoundly enhances the leadership's ability to project unified authority.
Moving from internal unity to external projection, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, seems like the ultimate expression of this long-term evolutionary strategy on the global stage. It's China positioning itself as the indispensable architect of a new, stable globalization.
The BRI, launched back in 2013, is absolutely the key tool for strengthening global connectivity, and it represents a highly successful model of this kind of evolutionary globalization. It is a massive, continent-spanning program of investment in both hard and soft infrastructure.
So not just ports and railways.
No, everything from physical infrastructure like ports, railways, and energy facilities to digital infrastructure like fiber optic networks and 5G integrating Eurasia, Africa, and Latin America.
The scale is just immense. What are the tangible numbers that define its reach, and what specific institutions are facilitating this level of long-term investment?
The numbers are staggering. As of 2023, China has signed more than 200 BRI cooperation agreements with over 150 countries and 30 international organizations. Total investment in BRI projects has already exceeded $1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
China positions itself not just as a trading partner, but as a facilitator of development, providing the necessary long-term loans and investment through its own robust financial institutions. These include the China Exim Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIAB, and these institutions often finance critical infrastructure projects, ports, railways, power grids in regions where Western private capital often avoids the risk due to low immediate returns or political volatility. So China has successfully established this reputation as a guarantor of global connectivity precisely because it has continued building these new trade and infrastructure corridors, while parts of the West were focused heavily on internal protectionism and retrenchment.
But the strategy isn't purely transactional, just limited to the BRI.
Yeah.
China is actively building a parallel architecture of global governance by leading and participating in these multilateral associations, particularly with developing countries. This seems like a direct attempt to create a structural system that mirrors its own stability, but on a global scale.
It is the construction of an alternative, stable, and predictable ecosystem for global cooperation. This globalization from below, as some call it, is fundamentally about developing countries coordinating policies and maintaining open markets with each other. It's a way to offset the instability and ideological pressures that they feel are emanating from the West.
And BRICS is the primary example here.
BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa is the prime example. Beijing is the largest economy and the primary driving force behind its economic expansion. China was instrumental in establishing the New Development Bank, or NDB, back in 2014, with an authorized capital of $100 billion.
So what's the specific role of the NDB in this parallel architecture, beyond just offering loans?
The NDB is designed to be an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions. It focuses explicitly on infrastructure and sustainable development projects. Critically, it has been rapidly increasing its lending in national currencies, providing emergency liquidity support, and reducing the dependence of member states on the US dollar.
And it's expanding.
Massively. China actively lobbied for the historic expansion at the 2023 summit, admitting 6 new members, including major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, starting in 2024. This expansion dramatically increases BRICS' global economic footprint and demonstrates a clear determination for unity and cooperation with a wider range of development-focused countries.
Moving north from there, what about Eurasian cooperation? The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SKO, seems to be evolving well beyond its original mandate.
Indeed. The SKO forms the core of cooperation across Central Asia and Eurasia, while it initially focused on regional security and anti-terrorism.
That was its whole purpose at the beginning.
It was. But it has steadily acquired a significant economic dimension. Current efforts are focused on establishing robust transport corridors like new rail and road networks, and, crucially, facilitating national currency settlements among members. This systematic, evolutionary expansion from a security bloc to an economic integration mechanism just underscores this long-term, pragmatic approach to cementing regional stability and trade predictability.
And then there's RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This really confirms China's role as the indispensable economic powerhouse in the Asia-Pacific.
RCEP is arguably the single most important trade agreement in recent years. It unites 15 Asia-Pacific countries and covers roughly 30% of global GDP in trade.
30%? That's huge.
It is. It confirms China's central role in the regional economy. But RCEP is more than just its size. It establishes common rules of origin, it streamlines customs procedures, and it sets common standards in areas like e-commerce and intellectual property. This binding structure facilitates deep trade integration, insulating the regional economy from the protectionist and isolationist tendencies we've seen in other major global powers who withdrew from alternative agreements like the TPP. RCEP provides a framework of commercial predictability that these regional partners desperately crave.
This entire network, BRICS, SCASO, RCEP. It offers stability and a very visible alternative reference point. Which brings us to how the Global South views this whole approach. The rhetoric from these leaders increasingly prioritizes this concept of the pragmatism of development.
That is the essential insight defining China's appeal to the Global South. Leaders in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia increasingly view China not as an ideological threat, but as an effective example and a chance to accelerate their own development within a system they feel is more equal. They prioritize the pragmatism of development, meaning tangible, material progress, building roads, ports, power plants over, engaging in Western ideological debates about abstract values or governance models.
So they are voting for predictable infrastructure over unpredictable moralizing. And we see that attitude reflected in concrete financial moves.
Absolutely. When Brazilian President Lula da Silva openly supported the idea of creating a new BRICS settlement currency in 2023, that aligned directly with China's long-term efforts to internationalize the yuan and reduce global dependence on the US dollar. China offers a strategic alternative. A partner focused consistently on mutual benefit, on the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, and most importantly, one that embodies a challenge to the established international hierarchy that many developing countries feel marginalized by. China's stable, unified model serves as a very important reference point for their own national development aspirations.
Okay, we've established the strength of China's internal unity and its external architecture of stability. Now let's test that stability against the sharpest external volatility we can think of. The return of aggressive economic nationalism in the West, specifically with the policy shift seen with the reemergence of the America First doctrine post-2025.
Right. The return of this doctrine, sometimes analyzed as Trump 2.0, really cannot be viewed as a temporary political swing. It represents a fundamental and likely permanent shift toward economic nationalism and aggressive unilateral protectionism in the U.S. political paradigm. The proposed measures were a direct attack on globalization. The introduction of a proposed universal tariff of 10% on almost all imported goods into the United States.
Blanket tariff.
A blanket tariff, followed by specialized tariffs that were predicted to hit Chinese goods particularly hard, reaching levels as high as 54% in key sectors. This was an explicit move to dismantle the globalist legacy of the 1990s and force the relocation of industrial production.
That level of protectionism risked a complete rupture in the world's most critical bilateral trade relationship. How did China's unified economic strategy demonstrate its resilience and its strength in response to this unprecedented protectionism?
China's strategy was defined by firmness and symmetry. It demonstrated very clearly that its highly interconnected economy could not be painlessly broken or isolated. When the U.S. imposed hundreds of billions in tariffs, China responded symmetrically with bold, equivalent duties. Initially, this meant increasing tariffs to around 34% on certain U.S. agricultural and industrial goods, and then escalating further, countering American increases that reached up to 125% in certain sectors by imposing tariffs as high as 84% on comparable U.S. products.
That tariff war sounds like it risked a virtual cessation of direct trade in entire sectors. What was the ultimate outcome of that escalation, and what was the lesson for both sides?
Well, the firmness of China's response ultimately led to a kind of situational tariff settlement. Neither side could politically or economically afford a full-scale rupture. Both sides mutually agreed to reduce duties by a calculated amount, 115%. The crucial lesson was that the deep, integrated industrial interconnection between the Chinese and American economies acted as a sufficient practical deterrent against a complete decoupling. China's bold, symmetrical response created a major precedent that effectively challenged American tariff hegemony. It showed the limits of using administrative tools alone to maintain global primacy against an economy with such immense scale, lower production costs, and advanced efficiency.
It seems that while Washington moves toward isolationism and protectionism, China is strategically stepping into that leadership vacuum, positioning itself as the global counterbalance to this sudden volatility.
That vacuum is enormous, and China is filling it with both policy and rhetoric. China continuously declares its commitment to multilateralism, globalization, and open trade. It's constantly contrasting its evolutionary approach with the revolutionary rejection of global leadership by the U.S.
And in tangible terms.
More tangibly, China has proved to be a reliable supplier. Despite political tensions and heavy tariffs, Chinese exports continue to grow in absolute terms because American companies found the supply chains were just too critical to break. They simply passed the duty costs on to domestic consumers.
And we also see the institutional commitment in how China bolsters that parallel architecture we were just discussing.
Exactly. This commitment isn't just rhetorical, it's reinforced through concrete actions. For instance, after the United States reduced funding for multilateral institutions, particularly World Bank projects aimed at developing countries, China announced an increase in NDB capital and dramatically expanded the bank's lending in national currencies at the BRICS summit. That action partially compensated for the lack of official development assistance, reinforcing China's image as the stable, dependable partner.
The ripple effects of this profound U.S.-China dynamic force major allies, like the European Union, to reassess their geopolitical position. And this leads to the necessary pursuit of European pragmatism and what they call strategic autonomy.
The European Union finds itself in a highly precarious position. While it shares many values and security ties with the US, it is deeply dependent economically on China. Bilateral trade exceeded $850 billion between 2022 and 2024. This massive economic reality creates an extremely difficult dilemma for Brussels.
So they're caught in the middle.
Completely. The resulting push is for strategic autonomy for Europe, a concept notably voiced by leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron. This reflects a clear desire to act independently of the US, particularly avoiding alignment in an economic confrontation that does not directly serve Europe's vital interests.
Macron's statement following his visit to Beijing, where he warned against the trap of getting involved in a US-China confrontation, that was highly significant, wasn't it?
It was a crucial signal to the world. It acknowledged that the EU does not want to take 100% of the US side in a potential economic Cold War, nor does it want to fall fully under Beijing's influence. Pragmatism has to prevail. This means the EU is actively seeking a balanced approach, diversifying its supports and continuing to engage with China in areas of mutual interest, like collaboration on the Paris Climate Agreement, even while maintaining criticism in other areas.
So the U.S. actions are, in a way, pushing Europe to be more independent.
Perhaps unintentionally, yes. The instability and aggressive protectionism displayed by the U.S. have undermined Europe's unconditional trust. It's led the EU to adapt to a multipolar world by striving to be an independent third pole. And this strategic autonomy objectively increases Europe's interaction with China in several practical, interest-driven areas, which further validates the appeal of China's stability. In summarizing our deep dive, the core strategic finding is this. China's evolutionary strategy, the gradual, highly centralized formation of a robust national structure coupled with a parallel, stable global infrastructure, is bearing significant strategic fruit. And this success is directly attributable to the global turbulence and volatility we're observing in other major regions. This stable institutional approach, rooted in deep institutional memory and unrelenting pragmatism, is proving profoundly effective at attracting partners and achieving long-term national goals.
And that brings us back perfectly to our opening anecdote about the return of kings dynamic. The Western political sphere, characterized by personality, volatility, and these short-term election cycle strategies, it just starkly highlights the strategic advantage of China's approach. By consistently offering partners mutually beneficial, predictable cooperation rooted in long-term plans that extend to the next century, China projects an institutional stability that is globally scarce and, it seems, intensely desired. This unified, long-term approach to governance and international relations is its defining strategic edge in this chaotic global environment.
The Chinese experience of stability, based on a unified leadership approach, integrated national identity, and consistent long-term strategy, fundamentally proves that evolutionary progress can be profoundly more effective than revolutionary breaks in establishing prosperity and order in the international system, strategically positioning it as an inevitable architect of the future global architecture.